Hello, this is Neil Sheth.
And I'm Katie Holmes, and this is Don't Do That, Do This podcast, brought to you by the British Chamber of Commerce, Dubai. We're sharing inspiring growth stories from companies that are based here or looking to the region to help you in your business growth.
Today, we have Nick Smallman. He is the founder and CEO of Working Voices, which is a global professional skills consultancy specialising in communication and leadership skills. He advises global blue-chip clients on engagement, productivity and retention, and counsels leaders on increasing revenue through simple cultural adjustments. I'm really looking forward to this. Before we jump into the interview, make sure you follow and subscribe the Don't Do That, Do This podcast across your main streaming platforms and social media. This podcast wouldn't have been possible without the following teams. Rightfully for storytelling and thought leadership, Studio Red for the quality podcast studio and video production, and Sherbet Lemon for branding, social media design and editing.
Thank you, Nick, for joining our podcast today on your visit to Dubai from London.
Great to be here.
Thank you so much. So we've got lots of questions to go through, but the first question, which we do for all our guests, is asking you, what is your favourite biscuit?
Well, this wasn't even close. And trust me, I've eaten a lot of biscuits in my life, literally thousands, but it's definitely the chocolate hobnob because it's got everything. And I imagine it's the most popular biscuit in the world, but maybe not. But you get a little boosted chocolate, you get the oats, you get the syrup. It's just got everything. It's like a little bit of magic in a biscuit.
Perfect. Well, you can have a whole box to yourself in the hotel room.
I'm delighted.
During your visit.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
That's how we got you on the pod. So
biscuits are very good. Yeah, it's good temptation.
And it's very popular actually on this podcast with our guests.
It's a firm favourite.
Yeah, I think we need to now start asking people, what's your favourite biscuit outside of chocolate hobnobs?
Yeah,
and see
so
what
monopolising the answers, right?
Yeah, I think so. Ready to work your voice?
Absolutely.
See what I did there?
I did. Very clever.
Yeah, I've been working on it all week.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah.
Who writes your stuff?
Yeah, me.
Okay.
So, Working Voices is a really good example of a company, establishing itself from very humble beginnings. So let's start with your journey.
My journey. Okay, so it's 1998, and I'm an unemployed actor. I mean, I trained as a classical actor, so I spent 3 years sort of doing Shakespeare and Chekhov and stuff like that, which was great. It's not going to earn you much money. Being an actor is uniquely strange because you have no safety net. You have an agent who's most of the time telling you you're wonderful without coming up with the goods. You go to a lot of auditions that you don't get. And a lot of it's there's a Greek mythology of Tantalus, the guy who's in the river and he's thirsty and there's the fruit above him and he can't get either. And the acting profession is very tantalizing, but ultimately most people are unemployed most of the time. And when you're young and in London, it's pretty hard. Anyway, I was in a lot of debt, about 60 grand's worth of debt. And for a student, that's a lot. And the reason is because in those days, people gave you credit cards for no reason whatsoever. So I was running up loads of debt and this got ridiculous. And I was lamenting the fact that I hadn't got any of the jobs that I went up for, really. I did bits and pieces, but nothing special. And then I was saying to a friend of mine, God, my life's a disaster. What am I going to do? And she said, well, you're really good at talking to people. Why don't you do that? So I said, all right. So I put an advert in a supermarket saying, would you like to learn to speak with confidence? That was my
On the
line.
corkboard.
On the corkboard, in Safeway, in Balham.
Safeway.
Yeah, that doesn't even exist anymore, right? In South London. And weirdly, lots of people started to reply to my advert. My first client was an 8-year-old boy called Dupinder, whose mother said, he doesn't speak. Can you please help him speak? So I just would sit and basically just try and coax words out of him.
Is this when you tell me that he's now an entrepreneur earning millions in...
I know he's in prison.
Oh.
No, just kidding. I have no idea. I hope he's doing okay. But he was very
Get in touch,
sweet.
Dupinder, if you're listening.
I would love to know what Dupinder is doing. But I got people from all walks of life. And what was fascinating, I realized very, very early on that there was an enormous market in people not being able to express themselves properly. And of course, coming from the theatre, expression is just second nature. But you realize that the other 99% of the population don't necessarily feel that's something they can do. So I started to work with people for a couple of years. And then I was playing cricket with some friends, and they were kind of like skeptical about what I was doing. And they said, well, you need a corporate client. And I said, okay. And they said, I bet you can't get a corporate client. And I went, I bet you I can. And so I wrote. I didn't really know what a corporate was. But, I was in the arts. I mean, it meant nothing to me. I'd seen it on TV, but that was it. So I wrote to the 50 biggest companies in the world. Bit daft if you think about it, but 2 got back to me. HSBC and Deutsche Bank got back to me.
When you say wrote, you mean like a letter
I wrote a
or
letter
email?
saying, emails didn't really exist then.
Okay.
Well, they might have done, but I certainly didn't. I didn't even have a computer.
Right, wow.
So I would go to those internet cafes and just stay up all night writing stuff. And I wrote to these companies, about 50 of them, and 2 got back, and I went in for an interview. And I remember them saying to me, so what is it you do? And I explained, and they said, how much do you charge? And I said, £25 an hour. And his face just dropped. And I went, is that too much? And he went, listen, pal, if you add a 0, I'll take you seriously. And that obviously got my attention. Anyway, I went to the bank, and as I said, I was in a lot of debt. And I said to the bank manager, I said, I know I'm in a lot of debt, but can you lend me £10,000, please? And he went, I can't do that. And I showed him one sort of remittance advice for 1 hour's work, 250 quid. And I said, I can get a lot more of this, but I need a computer and I need a suit. So he said no. And I basically sat in his office and I said, I'm not leaving, please go. And we went back and forth for about 2 hours. And eventually he said, okay, I'll lend you the money. Thank God. So I used that money to live, and I just started to phone people up. And
There must have been some suit.
Yeah, I was going to
the
say.
suit was super cheap.
Not Savills Row.
Definitely not. But I managed to start speaking to people. And what was interesting at that time, professional skills, which is the profession I'm in, was relatively new. And they were called soft skills, rather insultingly. Soft skills, like they weren't important. But actually, we're finding today, in today's world, they are the most important skills that people need. And so I started to work as a sole trader. And within 3 years, I needed more people. So I started to hire.
Yeah.
And then I started to go be invited, because I was working with mainly investment banks. I was doing lots of speeches to lots of people. And so they started to ask me to go abroad. So I would go to New York and places and do talks. And then the credit crunch happened. And they went, sorry, we're not going to fly you anymore. So I thought, well, I better hire some people in New York then. So I knew some people from drama school who lived in New York. They found me some people. I went over there. I started to interview them. They were brilliant. They started working for me the back end of 2007. Then the world collapsed. But we managed to sort of muddle through. I had very low overheads at the time because it was just basically me and my mum, believe it or not. My mum did my accounts, which is very sweet. And then I met a friend of mine in the pub in 2009, and he was based in Hong Kong. His wife was a teacher, and he liked what I did. And I said, well, do you fancy doing it? He said, yeah, I'd love to do it. So we set up a business in Hong Kong. And so by the end of sort of 2010, we'd weathered the financial crisis. And that's where things really started to kick off, because businesses were in disarray because of what had happened. And most of my clients were investment banks. And so over that time, we became very much leadership orientated and helping leaders basically to do the things they should have been doing in the first place, which is actually communicating properly with their staff, et cetera, et cetera. And then we digitized, and we got some e-learning and blah, blah, blah. That took us up to COVID. And then the world fell apart again. And here I am in 2024 with probably a new proposition.
What is that proposition? Can you just give us a bit more information?
Sure. Well, Working Voices has always been the sort of organization where you got a problem in the communication space, as in human communication, come and see us, we'll help you. Mm-hmm. But I always wanted to be ahead of my clients. I think that's really important. Mm-hmm. So we did a lot of research into why people aren't necessarily happy at work.
Okay.
And you've heard of quiet quitting?
Yes.
You know, I think Gallup says around 50-something% of people are quiet quitting, which means they're there, but they're not really there. People aren't getting the best out of people. People aren't really engaged. So we wanted to find out why this was the case. And it's fascinating. A lot of the big consultancies have this that publicly available data that you can start to mine. And what's really interesting is they're not engaged because they're overwhelmed a lot of the time. Humans, remember, we're tribal creatures. I'll give you a really interesting statistic. The average human takes on about 74 gig of information a day. That's in all devices, advertising, all the stimulus around us. That's a lot of stimulus. 500 years ago, the average highly educated person would take on 74 gig in a lifetime.
Crikey.
Right, and through stories and books. That's where we are right now. The problem is, for humans, is also our greatest strength is our greatest weakness. So we are very, very adaptable. We know this. We can adapt to anything. You know, climate change is going to kill the planet, but we're going to adapt to it because that's what we do, right? And it's the same with technology. Technology is this great panacea for change, and isn't it brilliant? But it's not. It's really bad for people. It's just very good for corporations. And the problem is that paradigm is not sustainable. So I've created a product called the Sustainable Human, which is about helping organizations to make the most of their people so they can be sustained through the next 10 years of rapid change. AGI is going to change everything. And if you bear in mind that technical skills, which are all the rage, they're not going to exist. They'll all be done by artificial intelligence. So the only skills left that really matter are these much derided human skills that 20 years ago, it's like, oh, soft skills, that's nice. That's a nice to have. Now it's a necessity. If you want a great business, your people have to be really good at communicating. And of course, we have this massive problem that young people in particular don't communicate that much.
Yeah.
They love to do stuff on their phone.
Yeah.
And that is incredibly bad for business and bad for people. I could go on, but that's it in a nutshell.
So it's fascinating, some of those stats, but the businesses listening in who struggle to communicate, whether they know it or don't, what's one or two things they can do to improve their communication today?
It's really simple. You have to make the time to really talk to people. Businesses feel that KPIs are everything. Simply not the case. A good business puts their people first and their customers second. I know that sounds slightly counterintuitive, but the customer will be okay if your people are okay. But if you put your customers first and your people second, your people will just disengage and maybe leave, or you won't get the best out of them. Having, as a manager, let's say you're a manager, maybe my generation, you're Gen X, and you're used to communicating, but the people you work with, younger people, will prefer to send an emoji instead of actually saying how they feel. Those skills need to be brought out of young people rapidly. And it needs to happen every day. There needs to be a culture of what I call social well-being, so that each leader creates an environment where trust is a thing. And it's not like, oh, let's all get together and go to the pub once a week. That's not social well-being. That's going to the pub once a week, which is nice, but it doesn't solve your problem. It's got to be completely woven into your culture. And if you can get that right, it's extraordinary the advance it can make to your business. And to give you some more stats, there's an amazing study by a neuroeconomist called Paul Zak. And he's like the leading thought leader on this. And he wanted to measure what it was about high trust companies that really made a difference. Because his view was that the higher the trust within an organization, the better a company performed. And the way to do it was he took people's blood and he measured levels of oxytocin in people's blood. So oxytocin is the neurotransmitter that you get when you love somebody or you feel a connection with people. So if you've got a dog or a child, or a lover or somebody that you care about and you hug them, you will release oxytocin. And it is without question the best feeling in the world. And it's in short supply in today's world. And the reason it's in short supply because we all operate in silos. We're all on our phones all the time. That isn't oxytocin, that's dopamine. That's a different neurotransmitter. And the tech companies have, and again, it's not a conspiracy. They're just trying to make money.
Yeah.
But they have got us hooked on these dopamine things. It used to be cigarettes.
Yeah.
Now it's our phones. The same stuff. You just get hooked on behaviors that go round and round and round. But actually what humans need, because we're tribal animals, is we need lots of oxytocin in our life. So going back to your question about what can a business leader do, they need to create behaviors that produce high levels of oxytocin. Then your people will be happy, they'll be more engaged, they'll be more productive, and they'll want to stay. And also they'll recommend your business to their friends.
As ambassadors.
Yeah,
exactly.
This really reminds me of my time at Accenture, actually. So one of the first companies I used to work for on a grad program, and we were on this project in Carillion, which didn't go too well, but yeah, so we were on this project, and a large number of the contractors that Accenture hired were from India.
Right.
And as you may or may not know, the Indian culture is very close. Like when they work together, they have lunch together. And I remember working on this project in Brentford, and when we would look at someone's laptop or the development that they're doing on their big screen, the contractors who work for Accenture would all stand around the screen and put their arms around each other, right? And they'd all watch the screen.
Yeah.
And I remember being part of that group because I was a junior project manager at that point. And they'd all put our arms around and it was amazing. We used to work really long hours, but I used to enjoy that project. And that's probably why. And we used to play table tennis together, and we used to have lunch together. Then we used to,
so you look forward to going into work.
Yeah,
exactly.
because of that that environment that was created. Not, I wouldn't say from the leadership team, but more from the culture, in specifically the Indian culture. That they brought across.
It's a really interesting point, and it's very true. And what's fascinating is, look, all businesses want to make money because they want to stay in business and they want to do well. I get that. But sometimes in our pursuit of what we call success, which is obviously the ROI and the profit margins, etc., we neglect the thing that actually drives the engine. And the problem with capitalism is it's a bit of a movable feast. I'm definitely a capitalist, but the form of capitalism we're in now, which is all about KPIs and all about results, it's not going to give you long-term success, because this generation coming up, they don't care about the economy the way my generation, Gen X, did. It's not all about rewards either. If you're all familiar, I'm sure the listeners will be familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And the one just below self-actualization is esteem and reward. In the 90s and the 80s, that's what it was all about. We wanted to just make lots of money, et cetera, et cetera. Nowadays, Gen Z, they care about belonging, which is the middle strata, and they care about safety. Because we live in a deeply uncertain world, it's interesting. The thing is, because everything's done in increments, we forget just how uncertain today's world is compared to maybe 20 years ago and certainly 30 years ago. And what's fascinating, because we've got all these hyper connections, everyone is so sort of networked. The delicious irony in all of this, of course, is that we're all deeply connected technically, and we're deeply disconnected emotionally. We've never been more disconnected as a society as we are today, because technology and companies drive us towards working in a silo. If you go on social media today, there'll be a million gurus telling you to focus on yourself and to put X into your body and to go to the gym and all this. Yeah, fine. The problem is, the one thing that's always missing from these gurus is be with other people. The most powerful form of well-being that any human can indulge in is conversation. What's fascinating is everyone looks like, how can I be successful? I've got to do this, I've got to do that. And they just drive themselves into sort of a ditch of misery because they're not reaching out to the networks and the people like your Indian friends. They understood instinctively that putting your arm around someone makes them feel good. They get that release of oxytocin. They feel a sense of togetherness.
Yeah.
And this is the big challenge for businesses now. If they can do this and they can create a culture, it's not just enough to have a one-off. You've got to do this all the time.
Yeah, it's easier said than done for sure.
Well, it's actually super easy, but it's whether people want to do it.
When, Nick, you talked about the talking being really critical, but listening,
Absolutely.
the active listening. So, you know, when someone perhaps thinks that they're a really good communicator, and you've got clients, some for 25 years, so you must have seen, even in one organisation, so much change, leaders thinking that they're doing a good job. How do you advise somebody that is talking but not listening?
Yeah. Well, the thing is, they sort of understanding this idea happens when you're listening. And of course, if you're not listening, you don't understand it. So it's a bit of chicken and egg. But the thing is, the most successful people on the planet are really good with people. They get people and they understand the value of people. But most importantly, they realize that their success is other people's success. You know, this is the complete mythology that billionaires, I did it all myself. No, you didn't. You did it off the backs of thousands, if not millions of people. That's why you've done really, really well. Our system just rewards people disproportionately for the work that they do. But when someone feels truly listened to, you change their state. And most importantly, going back to oxytocin, when someone feels really listened to, trust levels increase, oxytocin is released. Do you know what's really interesting? When oxytocin is released, the receptors in the brain, the ability for people to take on new information is increased because you feel trust. This goes back to when we were running around, 50,000 years ago. Trust back then was about survival. Weirdly, it still is. We just happen to wear better clothes and we happen to be in offices, but it's still about survival. So if you trust your team, you feel good, your ability to work and exchange information will be way better. So if a business leader really wants to build trust, it's not enough to say it. There's a lot of initiatives where people announce, so we're going to do this, we're going to be human-centric. I hear this a lot now. We're going to be human-centric leadership. And it's an announcement. It doesn't mean anything unless the behavior is human-centric. And to be genuinely human-centric, there are certain things you need to do. So, for example, like creating psychological safety in every team meeting. And what that means is that the individuals in the meeting, even the most shy person, who's your target audience, the most shy person feels that that place is safe for interpersonal risk, i.e., I can say something without feeling bad. So a really good example, I was on a conference, a call with a bunch of people from an investment bank. And I just asked, does anyone have any examples of psychological safety gone wrong? And one lady said, oh yeah, I've got a boss. He's a nice guy, but at the beginning of every meeting, he'll say, no stupid questions. And the problem is like, how do you know if a question is stupid or not? I can see what he's driving at. He says, let's try and keep this like highbrow and whatever. The problem is if you don't give people an opportunity to fail and to try stuff, you're shutting down all that amazing human capital that is in the room. And the problem is when you're KPI driven, all the focus is always on like, how can we get this done as quickly as possible? So business leaders become very transactional. And of course, that's a huge problem.
Yeah, I remember, this brings back so many memories. I remember some places that I've worked in and the meetings would have to be very structured, like to the point where you have to really articulate what you want to say and almost start with when I write an email, I'll generally go with the conclusion first, just because that's how I've been trained, and then goes from there. And when you're in a meeting, which is meant to be creative, bit of a brainstorm, when you're now told it has to be structured, now, rather than participating in the meeting, I'm in my head. I'm thinking about how to articulate this.
And how you come across.
Yeah, and how I come across. And I think I think what you just said there around giving people the opportunity to fail is so powerful. It's
You
just
learn
saying it's
nothing
okay.
from success, do you?
No, you don't.
Nothing.
And I always say, actually, our worst client is our best client because that's the one that we're going to learn from, right?
Absolutely.
So just to kind of switch gears, just on moving to growth.
Yeah.
So storytelling is
Yes.
a part of, you know, one of your courses and a topic that I'm deeply passionate about as well. So for the businesses listening,
Yes.
how can they apply storytelling to take their business?
Well, obviously, you've got all what I call the PR and marketing, which is your external storytelling. But just as important is your internal storytelling. Like, what's the story you're telling your staff? It's like, you know, people have a vision, and usually that vision is sort of mixed up in, you know, we're going to make this much money and all that. Who cares? What do the staff care about? The staff care about job security.
Yeah.
And they care about being part of something meaningful. So you've got it on a micro level. You've got stories. Have you ever heard of the expression incidental communication?
No.
Nope.
So this has been lost through COVID and going online. So you'll know that the culture nowadays in corporates is we're back to back. That's somehow a virtue of being back to back. It's terrible for relationships and terrible for businesses. But people say, oh, I'm back to back, like it's a good thing. Anyway, you get people at 29 minutes past saying, I've got to hop to the next call. In the old days, and I said the old days, I mean like a few years ago, people would walk from a meeting to another meeting. They'd have a chat with someone about stuff.
True.
It would give their mind a chance to decompress, but also it helped to build bonds with people. I would say the most vital stories in the modern world are the incidental, tiny little stories we tell each other that help us to grow close to one another. Again, I go back to releasing oxytocin. I'll leave the storytelling to PR companies and marketing companies, and that's part of like a much bigger strategy. But it's the internal stories that keep people in a job. The number one reason why anyone stays in work is the people they work with. It's as simple as that. But if you don't know the people you work with, why would you stay?
How do you measure that, Nick? So from working with an organisation, and obviously going in, hopefully before it's hit rock bottom.
Yeah.
How do you then demonstrate your value as well? What's the listening that you do and the talking to demonstrate your KPIs?
Right. So I answer this in two parts. Part one is the obvious stuff. You can measure things like engagement, productivity, and retention. They're quite easy. So, for example, before one of my programs, I'll say, right, draw a line of the sand, measure where you are. And then in 6 months, once we've delivered and given people the skills to create this social well-being, etc., and leadership capability, you measure again, and there's been a change. But the other thing I would say is there's a wonderful line I heard, and this is to all the businesses out there because this is really important. Businesses used to measure what they valued. Now businesses value what they can measure. There is a tyranny of measurement because every single organization is saying measure. But the problem is this is to the exclusion of the human experience. And then I had someone say to me the other day, exactly the question, how do you measure? And he was relatively hostile because obviously I was threatening the way he liked to do stuff. And I said to him, are you married? He said, yes. I said, do you love your wife? And he said, yes. And I said, how do you measure that? And then there was just silence. And then everyone started to laugh. And I said, exactly. You can't measure the human condition. Can you really put how you feel about someone on a spreadsheet? And corporates would love to do that. And AI will try to do that. But the point is, the more you dehumanize your workforce, the less fun it is. Because when you have these two drivers, one is we have to do more with less constantly, this sort of hangover from the financial crisis. And then to do that, you have this driver of adoption of rapid technology. You put those together, the sort of terrible subset of that is a lack of autonomy in your job. You feel like a cog in a machine. Once you do that, you've lost your people. So I would say you've got predictors like, retention, etc., that you can clearly measure this stuff. But when it comes to the human space, don't measure. Ask people. So, for example, a really, really excellent example of this is Google back in 2012, did a project called Project Aristotle, where they wanted to measure what made a good team, right? And this is really fascinating. They measured 100,000 people, I think, at Google. They measured all the teams, and they came back with nothing. Nothing. Because they're geeks and nerds, and that's what they do. They look for data. It's a data organization. So they said, well, this isn't really good. We spent all this money. What are we going to do? So they went back instead and looked at group norms. And they found that the most successful groups all had certain characteristics in common. You can't measure it, but they had much higher levels of trust and psychological safety. So it's not about hard data. It's about looking for norms of behavior and then asking yourself what works. And you find that companies, so groups, teams with high collective intelligence aren't the most intelligent individually, but what they do have is much higher levels of trust. So the collective is much better. And that is not anti-capitalist. They've got this terrible myth that you have to be an individual to get anything done. No. If you look at NASA putting a man on the moon, it was thousands of people working together for that simple thing. And any successful company is groups of people working effectively together. And once we understand that and get off this ridiculous hobby horse that it's all about individuals being in their silo with the headphones in and watching a screen, then the more successful we're going to be in the 2020s, because the 2020s will all be about togetherness.
And obviously we're focusing on corporates, but as you're speaking, I'm thinking, what's happening in schools?
Yeah.
And do you work in the education space? Would you like to?
I would love to. I mean, the words of George Benson, children are the future, aren't they? And what I would say is, again, you get this tyranny of measurement. It happened in Britain 20 years ago. It's like, let's just grade people by exams. So what happens? In order to grade people by exams, they become exam factories. And so kids are learning stuff to pass exams. They're not learning stuff to be great adults. I mean, the whole purpose of school is to turn a child into a well-functioning, well-rounded adult, right? But that doesn't necessarily happen. And it's the same. So I would say teaching kids good social skills so they can work with other children and then work with other adults is the most vital skill you can teach a child. And I guess it's the difference between private and state education. Private education, you get the ability to play more team sports. You get to do things like drama. That's where the extra value lies. And I think I've never really understood why we stick to a very, very sort of historic way of doing things.
Yeah.
So I would introduce critical thinking in schools. It's got to be the most vital skill of the modern world because we have so much rubbish online, and it's very easy because we don't think critically, especially when you're young, and you don't understand logic, to start believing stuff that's not true. And this infects everything we do.
What about remote teams? So building trust, building that social engagement. How do you like? We're a remote team,
Right.
To an extent, apart from Dubai. But so how do we build that connection and trust even better? So we've got Slack, which is actually pretty good. We've got the ability to fail.
Okay.
We do that really well. But we don't have that opportunity to walk with someone and have a coffee and a tea.
No, but what you could do is have sessions where it's not about work. You just chat with each other, get to know each other. If you can't meet
I like
them,
that.
just spend time. You see, people think, but that's wasting time. That's not efficient. The problem is that, again, you're trying to measure the hell out of everything. And who works 8 hours a day? No one I've ever met. Most people work a few hours a day, and the rest of the time they're daydreaming or they're looking at social media or whatever, because that's what people do. People are profoundly distracted nowadays. I think the average human looks at their phone 100 times a day. We touch our phone 2,500 times a day. I mean, it's not even a fair fight. So my suggestion, if you deliberately put time aside with remote teams to just, how are you? And have
what's your favorite biscuit?
Well, exactly. But
that's true.
Yeah,
but have individual conversations
Yeah.
with people, get to know people. I mean, my team's completely remote, but I'll just ring people up and just shoot the breeze with them. I spend more time probably just chatting with my staff than working. I like that because I always think again, the myth of hard work is just a load of rubbish. I think it's effective work, not hard work, because people have to know why they're doing stuff, and they have to feel they're doing it for other people. No one works in a vacuum, do they?
And this seems to be the new wave of the new generation coming into the workplace.
Exactly.
Is it through speaking to recruiters in the region and various things I've read? And it's about not how do I fit into an organisation, but it's how can I add? What value do I bring?
Culture add, not culture fit. Exactly. So what you're suggesting is that all organisations need to be deeply flexible in order to bring in the best for their organisation, and don't be scared of change.
And then trust again is so important, because just playing devil's advocate there is that you could have all these amazing schemes, but it only takes 2 or 3% to take advantage of it.
Yeah.
And that's probably the critical point, is understanding, well, communicating, as you've said, to make sure people understand why those schemes are in place, so that there isn't a failure, which then ruins it for everybody else. Yeah. Have you any examples of seeing that, where you've got an amazing scheme in place, you've got all of your trainings gone in, all the leaders, everyone's on board, but then there's a small percentage that
they don't get on board.
Yeah.
Well, I think but again, what we tend to do when someone doesn't get on board, we lean into it.
Okay.
And we'll probably take people to one side and have a chat with them and say, so how can I help? I mean, everyone has an in. You've just got to find out what it is. But if you're not taking the time, then they become collateral damage.
Yeah.
So you can make sure things work 100%, but it's about getting everybody to the table.
And that would have to be in person, presumably, as well, because you'll be able to read people a bit better face to face. Yeah.
I mean, think about it. Zoom calls are a bit like the Muppets. We're all in boxes sort of waving at each other, but it's that weird thing. Whereas I'm talking to you now, but I'm switching my eye contact. Whereas if I'm talking to you on Zoom, I'm just staring at nothing.
Or yourself looking back at you.
Well,
it's horrible,
but you
isn't
can
it?
switch that off. You
Your
don't
background.
have to be. Yeah, exactly. And I think we've become really used to Zoom because it's efficient, but it doesn't necessarily help the business.
True.
So yes, face-to-face where you can. Even if you are remote, get together where you can. If that's not possible, take time for incidental conversation to really get to know people. People can tell. You can tell when someone is sincere. Yeah. Because we live in a kind of everyone's look out for what they can get kind of culture. You know when someone's trying to sell you something, and you know when someone actually does want to know who you are and they're genuinely interested in you. We can tell. So actually, the trick for businesses, and I would say to anyone listening to this, if you are a business owner, don't sort of roll your eyes and go, oh, okay, if I have to, say, this is one of the greatest opportunities to make my business better, because this comes down to psychology, it comes down to biology, it even comes down to physiology of making people feel better at work. And that is the key to you being competitive in the 2020s.
And that
great soundbite.
That's a great sound. That sounds like a radio. So I love that as an ending. I think the one thing I'm going to take away just from there is the incidental conversations, and I think we do a lot of that. Personally speaking, online on Slack, but we don't do enough of that on Zoom. So,
but make sure it's conversation, not writing.
Yeah. We'll talk about hobnobs and things like that.
Whatever. Well, because people are multi-layered. They've got so much that makes them interesting beyond their work.
Yeah.
And my takeaway is aiming for the shyest person in the room for them to feel the safest, and creating that psychological safety.
Because they passed exams, they went to university maybe, and there's all that amazing intellectual capital that half the time doesn't leave their head. What a waste of money.
Yeah.
Right?
That's a good way of looking at it. Thank you so much, Nick, for sharing your wisdom.
Thanks
Look forward
so
to
much.
seeing you next time you're in Dubai. And if anybody wants to reach out to you, you're very responsive on LinkedIn, I'm sure.
Sure. Yeah.
Is that the best place for them to connect, or
they can
the website?
Well, nick@workingvoices.com. Then go to my website.
Okay.
Check it out. Whatever works for people.
Brilliant. Thank
Tomorrow
you.
You'll get 100 messages. So,
well, let's hope so.
Nick, thanks so much. And
you're welcome.
For those listening, thanks for listening. Hope you've enjoyed this podcast with Nick Smallman. And if you want to follow and subscribe, please do to the Don't Do That, Do This podcast.